Timber! Good morning, boys and girls. My name is Miss Brittany, and I am your host. This is your teacher, Miss Valerie. Today, we will learn about the elements of a tall tale.
Today's lesson is titled Paul Bunyan. By the end of today's lesson, we will be able to identify tall tales as a type of fiction, identify the characters, plot, and setting of Paul Bunyan, and identify the exaggeration and larger-than-life characteristics of the tall tale Paul Bunyan. Let's go ahead and get started. Miss Brittany, guess what I did this weekend?
What did you do?
I went fishing.
Really? Did you catch anything?
You wouldn't believe it. I caught a fish that was this big. I could hardly reel it in. I fought and I fought until finally it took 3 grown men and women to help me get it on the pier.
Is that true? Sounds like an exaggeration to me.
Exaggeration? Psh, that's not an exaggeration. Wait, what's an exaggeration?
An exaggeration is an overstatement of the truth. An example of exaggeration might be someone catching a small fish, and each time they tell about it, the fish gets bigger and bigger in the story.
Oh, well, maybe I did stretch the truth a little bit. Boys and girls, the next several read-alouds we will hear are tall tales. A tall tale is a type of folk tale. Like other folk tales, tall tales are first told orally, that means out loud, many years ago, and they were later written down. Tall tales are humorous stories, often about real-life heroes of the American frontier during the 1800s. The word frontier has 2 different meanings. A frontier can be a boundary or the edge of a country or land. It can also describe the unexplored areas of a country or place. The first European settlers lived on the east coast of the United States. Let's take a look at a map. The tall tales you are about to hear are about the men and women who moved from the east coast to the American West and helped to tame the land or make it more livable for others. Logging was one way men and women thought they could make the land in the American frontier more livable. Logging is the process of cutting down trees and turning them into building materials. Lumberjacks or loggers cut down the trees so they could be made into boards used for building. In our story, we will hear that the lumberjacks were full of admiration for Paul Bunyan. Say that word after me. Admiration.
Admiration.
If you have admiration for someone or something, that means you have a feeling of deep respect and liking or wonder for someone or something. The American people, for example, have a great deal of admiration for the first astronaut who walked on the moon. Miss Brittany, do you have an admiration for anyone?
I sure do. I have admiration for the librarian who keeps all of our books organized and cataloged.
That's a great example. Boys and girls, do you have admiration for anyone? I'm sure you do. Today, I'd like for you to find someone you have admiration for and tell them using a sentence like this. I have such admiration for you because, and then tell why. Today, we will use the anchor chart behind us to demonstrate our learning. Notice the column on the left has the titles Characters, Setting, and Plot. You may be familiar with these elements from other stories. Miss Brittany, what is a character?
The character is who or what the story is about. Most of the time, a character is a person or animal.
That's right. What about the setting and the plot?
The setting tells when and where a story takes place, and the plot is a summary of the events in the story.
Excellent. Boys and girls, we also have a row for realistic details and exaggerations. Realistic details are details in a tall tale that could happen in real life, like catching a fish. An important characteristic of all tall tales, however, is the exaggeration of some of the details. Say that word after me. Exaggeration.
Exaggeration.
Exaggeration in a tall tale makes the main character seem larger than life. He or she is always bigger and stronger, smarter and faster than real people. The main character in today's tall tale, Paul Bunyan, was a famous lumberjack or logger. What do you see in the illustration? Paul Bunyan is a fictional character, and much of what we hear about him in today's read aloud will be exaggeration. As mentioned, Paul Bunyan was a natural-born logger or lumberjack who moved to the American frontier from Maine. Let's take a look at the U.S. map again and locate Maine. Maine is a state in the top right corner of the United States, or the far northeast. Today, as we read the tall tale about Paul Bunyan, I want you to listen for examples of exaggeration. Let's begin. Even as a baby, Paul Bunyan was mighty big. How big? Well, he was so big that his parents had to use a covered wagon for his cradle or baby bed. As you might imagine, young Paul Bunyan had a big appetite. He gobbled up 5 barrels of porridge a day, and his parents had to milk 4 dozen cows every morning and evening just to keep his baby bottle filled. Paul was so big, it caused some problems in the little town in Maine where he grew up. When he sneezed, he blew the birds from Maine to California. When he snored, the neighbors ran out of their houses hollering, "Earthquake! Earthquake!"
Wait just a second, Miss Valerie. Are you telling me there was actually a baby so big that he slept in a wagon instead of a cradle and that his snores were like earthquakes?
Well, that's what this tall tale says. But remember, tall tales have elements of exaggeration. So there might have been a big baby, but when the story was told over and over, people exaggerated how big and loud he really was. Let's keep reading to see if we can find more examples of exaggeration. After that, Paul's father thought it might be better if Paul didn't sleep in town. He built a cot on a large raft for Paul and floated it off the coast. Paul slept on the raft for a few nights, but the floating cot didn't work out. When Paul turned over in his sleep, he caused gigantic waves that knocked down houses along the coast. Eventually, Paul's father decided that the East Coast was just too small for Paul Bunyan. The only sensible thing to do was to move out west. So the Bunyan family moved to Minnesota. Here's our map again. Notice that the arrow points from Maine, where Paul Bunyan was born, to Minnesota, where Paul Bunyan and his family moved so that he could have more room. In those days, Minnesota was full of logging camps, sawmills, and lumberjacks.
Lumberjacks?
Yes, Miss Brittany. A lumberjack is someone who cuts down trees. The sawmill is where the trees are turned into boards. But let's keep reading. Americans were moving west and building the country. They had to cut down a lot of trees to make their homes, not to mention their schools, churches, boats, and furniture. When he grew up, Paul Bunyan went to work as a lumberjack, and what a lumberjack he proved to be. He made himself a giant axe with a handle carved out of a full-grown hickory tree. He could bring down a giant tree with a single swing of his axe. As the tree tipped over, he would yell, "Timber!" so the other lumberjacks had time to get out of the way. Boys and girls, could a man really make an axe with the top of a tree or chop down a giant tree with one swing of his axe? Are these examples of exaggeration? What do you think, Miss Brittany?
They sound like exaggerations to me.
That's right. Let's keep reading. Everyone looked up to Paul Bunyan, way up. The other lumberjacks were full of admiration for him. The bosses were grateful for the amazing amount of work he could do in a day. Paul had a big heart, too, but one thing he always wished for was a true friend. There simply wasn't anybody else his size who could be his friend. That all changed during the winter of the big blue snow, because it was called the winter of the big blue snow because it was so cold that everyone shivered and turned blue. Even the snow shivered and turned blue. One day, as Paul made his way through the blue snowdrifts, he heard a muffled whimper. He followed the noise until he saw two big blue furry things sticking up out of the snow. He reached down and gave a pull. Boys and girls, what do you think was in the snow? Let's find out. It turned out that the two big blue furry things were two big blue ears. And connected to the big blue ears was a giant blue baby ox. Paul exclaimed, "The poor little fellow is half frozen." Paul carried the blue ox home, wrapped him in blankets, and fed him. The baby ox was so content that he took a long nap in Paul's big, strong arms. When he woke up, he looked up at Paul, and do you know what he said? "Mama, Mama!" Then he gave Paul a big, slobbery lick on the face. Paul laughed and said, "Babe, we're going to be great friends." And they were. In fact, Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox were soon inseparable. Inseparable means they couldn't be separated. Everywhere that Paul went, Babe went too. The two of them worked together in the lumber camps. Paul chopped down the trees. Then Babe hauled them to the river and dropped them in so they could float downstream to a sawmill. Together, Paul and Babe did the work of 100 men. The lumber company figured the best way to keep Paul Bunyan happy was through his stomach. So they hired a special cook to feed Paul and Babe. The cook's name was Sourdough Sam. Sourdough Sam was known for the giant flapjacks he cooked in the world's biggest frying pan. The colossal, or unbelievably large, pan sat on an enormous cast iron frame. Every morning, Sourdough Sam would build a raging forest fire underneath the pan. Then he would call for his two helpers, Lars Larson and Pete Peterson. Lars and Pete would grease up the pan by tying slabs of bacon to their feet and skating back and forth across the sizzling pan. Then Sourdough Sam would make a giant stack of pancakes for Paul and an even larger stack for Babe. Thanks to Sourdough Sam and his overgrown flapjacks, Babe eventually grew to be even bigger than Paul. He was so big that if you were standing at his front legs, you had to use a telescope to see all the way to his back legs. In fact, he was so heavy that his footprints filled up with water and turned into lakes. In fact, there are more than 10,000 lakes in Minnesota today, and most of them were created by Babe the Blue Ox back in the frontier days.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. Wait just a minute. I find it hard to believe that an ox would be so big you'd need a telescope to see from its front legs to his back legs. And his footprints becoming more than 10,000 lakes? That has to be an exaggeration.
You're absolutely right, Miss Brittany. Boys and girls, I hope you are noticing some of these exaggerations too. Let's read on. Babe and Paul helped the lumberjacks solve all sorts of problems. Once there was a river that was full of twists and turns. Sometimes the trees would get stuck in the turns and never make it downstream to the sawmill. But Paul Bunyan thought of a way to fix that. He went to one end of the river and sent Babe to the other end. Paul grabbed the river and pulled in one direction. Babe pulled the other end in the opposite direction. Then, snap! Just like that, all of the kinks were pulled out, and the river was as straight as an axe handle. Of course, this tightening operation left the river a good deal longer than it had been before, and there was a lot of extra water lying around. Paul and Babe worked together to dig 5 big holes to hold all the extra water. Nowadays, these are called the Great Lakes. This is a photo taken of the Great Lakes. There are 5 major lakes in this system, and they make up the largest freshwater system in the world. Let's keep reading. One day, the logging bosses got to talking. One of them said that the United States was a fine country, to be sure, but it could still stand a little improvement. For one thing, it could use a few more rivers. And what it really needed was a big river running right down the middle of the country, all the way from Minnesota down to New Orleans. If we had a river like that, the man said, we could ship timber down to New Orleans and all around the world. Paul Bunyan happened to overhear this conversation. He told the bosses he would see what he could do. He hitched up Babe and they started plowing south. As they plowed, they threw a great mound of dirt and rocks to the right and a smaller mound to the left. On the right side, they made the Rocky Mountains, and on the left side, they made the Appalachian Mountains. Take a look at these beautiful Rocky Mountains. Do you think a man and an ox could really dig up enough dirt and rocks to create entire mountain ranges? Of course not. That's an exaggeration. Paul Bunyan and Babe didn't stop until they had plowed a channel all the way south to the Gulf of Mexico. And the river that flows in that channel nowadays is what we call the Mississippi River. Here's an image of the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River was a very important means of transportation in the frontier days and still is today. Let's read the conclusion of our tall tale. From that day on, Paul and Babe went around the country using their size and strength to help anyone who needed it. Later, they dug the Grand Canyon as they made their way to the west coast of California. And when the wind blows just right from the west, you can still smell those infamous, colossal pancakes cooking on the frontier.
Whoa, I believe there are a lot of examples of exaggeration in that tall tale.
You're right, Miss Brittany. Can you name one?
Well, I don't think Paul Bunyan and Babe really dug the Mississippi River.
Exactly. That's an exaggeration. Boys and girls, what are some other things in nature that Paul Bunyan supposedly created? Miss Brittany, can you think of other things in nature that Paul Bunyan supposedly created? Remember to answer in a complete sentence.
According to the tale, Paul Bunyan supposedly created the Grand Canyon, the Rocky Mountains, and the Great Lakes.
Great job, Miss Brittany. And great job, boys and girls. Now, what are some things in this story that could have happened in real life?
I know. A boy could have really taken care of an ox calf in real life. Also, it's true that people cut down trees and built homes while expanding west.
Good. Those are realistic details. Let's add some of these details to our chart. First, let's identify our main character.
Boys and girls, who was the main character in our story today?
Yes, that's right. If you said the main character was Paul Bunyan, the lumberjack, you're right. Let's add that to our table. We've talked about several landscapes in our story, but we can say that the setting was in what area overall?
Boys and girls, do you remember? The setting is the American frontier in the 1800s.
Great. Let's add that to our table too. To summarize the plot of our story today, I'd say that Paul Bunyan is a tall tale about an amazing lumberjack. He and his ox cut down entire forests with one swoop of the axe, and they are credited with creating many natural landscapes in America.
What a great summary. It hits the overall main events of the story.
That's right. And we've already talked about realistic details and exaggerations. So let's decide if these next details are realistic or exaggerated, and then add them to our table. What about a man and an ox straightened a river by pulling on each end?
I believe that is an exaggeration because it couldn't possibly happen in real life.
Very good. How about people moved west and built homes out of logs from trees? In which row would it belong?
During the frontier days, and even now, people really did move west and build homes from trees. So that's a realistic detail.
That's right. We'll add it to that row. Next we have, a boy was so big his bed was a covered wagon. What do you think, Miss Brittany? Is that realistic or an exaggeration?
I believe that's an exaggeration.
You're right again. We'll add it to the row labeled exaggeration. And lastly, a boy took care of an ox calf. Boys and girls, is that a realistic detail or an example of exaggeration?
Did you say realistic detail? If you did, you've got it. We'll add it to our chart.
In our next lesson, we will read another tall tale and look for some of these same elements of tall tales.
Thank you for joining us today. All rights and credits from this lesson belong to Core Knowledge Language Arts. We would like to thank them for publicly sharing these materials.
If you are interested in reading more about Paul Bunyan, check out these books at your local library or online. The Bunyans by Audrey Wood, Paul Bunyan, retold and illustrated by Stephen Kellogg, and Paul Bunyan versus Hals Housen, The Giant Lumberjack Challenge by Teresa Bateman.
Together with your family, you may also want to visit www.wisconsinhistory.org to read the Origins of Paul Bunyan story.
Use what you learned today. Go tell someone at home about Paul Bunyan and tall tales. And remember to use the word admiration in a sentence.
Thanks for joining us today. We'll see you again soon.